You're telling this court that a custodian understands constitutional law better than licensed attorneys? Judge Claire Whitmore asked, her voice carrying across the packed courtroom as a ripple of laughter spread through the gallery. The sound echoed against polished wood panels and marble columns, lingering a moment longer than it should have. Ethan Walker stood quietly near the witness stand, his gray maintenance uniform neatly pressed despite the long day that had already begun before sunrise. His hands rested calmly at his sides. He did not argue. He did not react. He simply listened. That only seemed to encourage the amusement around him. The attorneys exchanged knowing looks. A few spectators shook their heads. To them, he was just the man who emptied trash bins, polished courtroom railings, and mopped the floors after everyone else had gone home. No one noticed the elderly man seated near the back row suddenly straighten in his chair. No one noticed the concern that crossed his face. And no one knew that the law Judge Whitmore had just quoted carried a secret connected directly to the quiet man standing before her. The late afternoon sun filtered through the courthouse windows, casting long golden lines across the floor. Outside, traffic rolled steadily through downtown Lexington County. Inside, every eye remained fixed on Ethan Walker. The case itself had already drawn statewide attention. Hundreds of working families were at risk of losing their homes after a powerful development company claimed legal ownership of several aging neighborhoods. Reporters lined the walls. Cameras waited outside. Careers were being built on whatever happened inside Courtroom 3. Yet at that moment, the focus had shifted away from billion-dollar contracts and legal strategy and settled squarely on a single father in a maintenance uniform. Mr. Walker, Claire continued, adjusting her glasses, the court appreciates your willingness to testify. However, legal interpretation is not your responsibility. Another quiet chuckle moved through the room. Ethan finally lifted his eyes toward the bench. They were calm eyes, tired eyes, the kind that had seen disappointment often, enough to stop fearing it. I understand, Your Honor, he said softly. I only wanted to clarify the wording. The wording is already clear, one attorney interrupted. That's why it's written into law. More laughter followed. Ethan nodded once. Again, he did not argue. For a brief moment, silence returned. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Papers rustled. A bailiff shifted his weight near the courtroom door. Somewhere beyond the walls, a distant clock struck 4. Then Judge Whitmore leaned forward. Mr. Walker, with all due respect, cleaning this courthouse does not make you a legal scholar. The gallery laughed louder this time. A few reporters smiled while scribbling notes. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly toward the polished floor he had personally waxed only 2 nights earlier. The reflection of the courtroom lights shimmered beneath his shoes. He remembered another room many years ago, another audience, another set of expectations. Memories came and went like distant weather now. He rarely allowed himself to dwell on them. Life had become simpler since then. Work, home, his daughter Lily, hospital appointments, bills, long nights, quiet mornings. There was comfort in simplicity. There was dignity in surviving. When Ethan finally looked up again, his expression remained unchanged. You may be right, Your Honor, he said. But words matter. Something about the way he said it caused a faint hesitation to pass across Claire's face. It lasted less than a second before disappearing beneath professional confidence. Of course they do, she replied. That is precisely why courts rely on law, not personal opinion. Ethan nodded slowly. I agree. Another pause settled over the room. Then, unexpectedly, he added, that's why the final sentence of Section 18 was written the way it was. The room became noticeably quieter. Several attorneys exchanged glances. One reporter stopped typing. Judge Whitmore narrowed her eyes slightly. Written the way it was? She repeated. Ethan offered a small, almost invisible smile. Yes, Your Honor. The elderly man in the back row closed his eyes for a moment as if he already knew what was coming. And for the very first time. That afternoon, the laughter in Courtroom 3 disappeared completely. The silence lingered only a few seconds before the machinery of the courtroom began moving again. Pens resumed scratching across legal pads. A reporter cleared his throat. Someone near the back shifted in a wooden seat. Yet something subtle had changed. The confidence that had filled the room moments earlier no longer felt quite as solid. Judge Claire Whitmore glanced down at the open case file before her. The expression on her face remained composed, but her eyes lingered on Ethan Walker a fraction longer than before. "Thank you, Mr. Walker," she said. "You may step down for now." Ethan nodded respectfully and returned to his seat near the side wall. As he sat, he folded his hands calmly in his lap. He looked exactly like what everyone believed him to be, a courthouse custodian nearing middle age, a man whose uniform carried faint traces of floor wax and cleaning solution, a man who blended into hallways and elevators and maintenance closets. Invisible, ordinary, forgettable. The hearing continued. Attorneys argued. Witnesses testified. Legal citations filled the air. Yet every so often Claire found her attention drifting back toward Ethan. His quiet remark about Section 18 unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. Most people could quote a law. Some could interpret one. But there had been something different in the way he said written the way it was. Not studied. Not memorized. Familiar. Personal. As if he remembered the sentence being created. Claire immediately dismissed the thought. It was impossible. During a brief recess, she stepped into her chambers overlooking the courthouse square. The late afternoon sun painted the brick buildings outside in shades of amber and gold. She loosened her shoulders and reached for a bottle of water. "You seem distracted," her clerk, Daniel Mercer, observed. Claire offered a faint smile. "Do I? Only when something does not make sense." Daniel gathered several documents from her desk. "And Mr. Walker does not make sense." Claire looked toward the window. "No, he does not." Meanwhile, 3 floors below, Ethan pushed a janitorial cart slowly down. A quiet hallway. The courthouse had begun emptying for the evening. Doors closed. Elevators chimed. The scent of old paper and polished wood drifted through the building. He worked methodically, the same way he always had. One trash bin, then another. One hallway, then the next. No hurry. No complaints. A small vibration in his pocket interrupted the routine. He pulled out his phone. A text message appeared on the screen. It was from Lily, his daughter. The message contained only 4 words. "How was court today?" Ethan smiled. It was a tired smile, but genuine. He typed back immediately. "Long day. How are you feeling?" Several moments passed before her reply arrived. "Better today. Nurse says I walked farther." His smile grew slightly. That mattered more than anything that had happened inside courtroom 3. More than lawyers. More than judges. More than headlines. For 11 years, Lily had been the center of his world. Every extra shift, every overnight cleaning contract, every sacrifice pointed toward one purpose, giving her a future. Ethan slipped the phone back into his pocket and continued down the corridor. As he passed a large display case containing photographs of former judges, he barely glanced at it. He had walked this hallway thousands of times. The faces had become part of the wallpaper. Yet another employee stopped him. "Evening, Ethan." "Evening, Frank." Frank Ramirez, a courthouse security officer nearing retirement, nodded toward him. "Word is you surprised a few people upstairs today." Ethan chuckled softly. "I doubt that. You always say that." Frank smiled. "Still, half the building is talking about it." Ethan shook his head. "People will find something new tomorrow." Frank watched him continue down the hallway. There was something admirable about Ethan. Not because he was brilliant. Not because of any mystery attached to his past. But because praise never seemed to interest him. Recognition never changed him. He carried himself with the same quiet dignity, whether people ignored him or noticed him. Upstairs, Claire sat alone after everyone had left. The courthouse had grown unusually quiet. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Shadows stretched across shelves filled with legal volumes. On her desk sat an open binder containing the full text of Section 18. Claire read the final sentence again. Then again. She frowned slightly. A strange feeling lingered in the back of her mind. The wording was elegant. Precise. Unusually precise. The kind of language that reflected not only legal expertise, but deep personal conviction. She turned to the author information attached to an old legislative summary. Most names were familiar. Professors, analysts, advisors. Then her eyes stopped. For a moment, she thought she had read it incorrectly. Slowly, she leaned closer to the page. The name felt impossible. Yet there it was, printed clearly beneath the committee record. Ethan Walker. Claire stared at the page for several long seconds. The courthouse around her seemed to fade into the background. The humming lights overhead. The distant sound of an elevator opening and closing. The occasional footsteps echoing through nearly empty hallways. All of it became strangely distant. Her eyes remained fixed on the same line. Ethan Walker. She read it again. Then a third time. The legislative summary had been archived more than 20 years earlier. The document listed contributors from some of the most respected legal institutions in the country. Constitutional scholars, policy advisors, senior professors, and among them sat the name of the courthouse custodian she had publicly dismissed only hours ago. Claire leaned back slowly. "That cannot be right," she whispered. Yet the record remained unchanged. She opened another file, then another. The deeper she searched, the more the impossible began turning into fact. Ethan Walker had not merely contributed comments. He had helped draft entire sections of the housing reform framework now studied in law schools across America. Several legal articles cited his research. One publication referred to him as a rising legal mind whose work could reshape property rights for working families. Claire felt a strange tension settle in her chest. The image she had formed of Ethan throughout the day no longer matched the evidence sitting in front of her. At nearly 7 o'clock, she gathered several printed records and walked toward the office of Chief Clerk Harold Benson. If anyone knew courthouse history, it was Harold. The 72-year-old clerk had worked there longer than almost anyone. She found him organizing files behind a cluttered desk. "Harold, do you have a minute?" He adjusted his reading glasses and smiled. "For you, Judge Whitmore, always." Claire placed the documents in front of him. "Tell me about Ethan Walker." The smile vanished almost immediately. Harold looked down at the papers, then back at Claire, then down again. "So you found it?" Claire frowned. "Found what?" Harold released a slow breath. "The part of Ethan he never talks about." The room fell quiet. Harold removed his glasses and folded them carefully. 20 years ago, people thought he was going to become one of the most influential legal scholars in the country. Claire remained silent. Full scholarship, top of his class, published before most students finished their second year. Harold shook his head slightly. Professors used to compete for his attention. Claire stared at him. "Then why is he cleaning hallways?" Harold looked toward the courthouse window where the last traces of daylight were fading behind the skyline. "Life happened." The answer carried no bitterness, only sadness. "What does that mean?" Claire asked. Harold hesitated. "It means there are stories more important than careers." Neither spoke for a moment. The old clerk finally stood and walked toward a filing cabinet. He opened a drawer and retrieved a yellowed newspaper clipping protected inside a plastic sleeve. The photograph showed a much younger Ethan standing beside a panel of legal scholars in Washington. He looked confident, ambitious, full of possibility. Claire barely recognized him. "What happened after this?" she asked. Harold studied the picture. His wife became seriously ill. Claire lowered her gaze. "I did not know he was married." "Most people do not." Harold nodded. He turned down prestigious offers, left academic work, moved back here, took whatever jobs he could find. Claire felt her stomach tighten. To take care of her? To take care of his family. Harold returned the clipping to its sleeve. After she passed away, he raised Lily alone. The room became very still. Claire remembered the maintenance uniform, the tired eyes, the calm voice, the complete lack of resentment when others laughed. Suddenly those things seemed far more remarkable than any legal achievement. Outside, darkness settled across the courthouse square. Claire eventually thanked Harold and walked back toward her chambers. As she passed through the main hallway, she noticed a faint glow coming from the lobby below. Ethan was there, alone. He moved a mop slowly across the marble floor beneath the courthouse seal. The polished surface reflected the overhead lights like still water. No audience watched him. No reporters followed him. No one applauded. Yet he worked with the same care and precision he had shown on the witness stand. Claire stopped at the balcony railing above and observed him quietly. For the first time, she was not looking at a custodian. She was not looking at a witness. She was not even looking at a legal scholar. She was looking at a man who had sacrificed recognition without ever asking the world to notice. And somewhere deep inside, a question began to form. If Ethan Walker had truly walked away from everything, what secret could possibly be important enough to make a man abandon a future that extraordinary? The next morning arrived beneath a blanket of gray clouds hanging low over Lexington County. Rain tapped softly against courthouse windows while commuters hurried along wet sidewalks carrying coffee cups and umbrellas. Inside the courthouse, the familiar rhythm of another workday had already begun. Security scanners hummed. Elevators moved steadily between floors. Clerks carried stacks of files through narrow hallways lined with framed portraits and aging legal records. Ethan Walker arrived before 6 o'clock, just as he always did. The building was nearly empty except for a few maintenance staff and overnight security officers finishing their shifts. He pushed his janitorial cart across the marble lobby with the same steady pace that had defined his life for years. No one would have guessed that a man whose legal research still influenced courtrooms across the country spent his mornings replacing trash liners and polishing brass railings. Yet Ethan seemed perfectly content with the contradiction. He greeted people by name. He asked about their families. He remembered birthdays. Small acts of kindness had quietly replaced ambition long ago. As he worked, his phone vibrated again. This time it was a photograph from Lily. She sat near a hospital window holding a sketchbook in her lap. A bright smile stretched across her face despite the medical equipment visible behind her chair. Under the photograph, she had written a simple message. "Look what I drew today." Ethan opened the image and smiled. It showed a courthouse surrounded by trees beneath a bright blue sky. In the center stood a man wearing a maintenance uniform. Beside him stood a young girl holding his hand. Above them, she had written 3 words. "My favorite hero." Ethan stared at the picture for several seconds. The noise of the building seemed to fade away. Recognition from universities had never mattered much to him. Awards had faded. Titles had disappeared. But those 3 handwritten words carried more weight than every professional honor he had ever received. Meanwhile, on the 4th floor, Claire Whitmore sat alone inside her chambers reviewing documents she had stayed late to study. The deeper she searched into Ethan's history, the stranger the story became. Records showed academic achievements that should have led to national prominence. Former colleagues described him as brilliant. Several legal scholars still referenced his early work. Yet after a certain point, the trail simply stopped. There were no major interviews, no prestigious appointments, no political ambitions. It was as though a man standing at the peak of a mountain had voluntarily turned around and walked away. Daniel Mercer entered carrying a fresh folder. "You are still looking into him," he observed. Claire did not deny it. "Does that surprise you?" "A little." Daniel smiled faintly. Most judges would have moved on. Claire closed one file and opened another. Most judges did not spend yesterday being corrected by the author of the law they were quoting. Daniel laughed quietly before noticing she was completely serious. His smile faded. "You really think there is more to this?" Claire looked toward the rain streaking the window. "I know there is." Later that morning, the housing case resumed. The courtroom filled once again with attorneys, journalists, and concerned residents whose futures depended on the outcome. Tension lingered beneath every conversation. The development company remained confident. Their legal team arrived carrying boxes of documents and polished presentations. Across the aisle sat families who feared losing homes they had lived in for decades. As proceedings began, Claire found herself noticing details she had ignored before. Ethan sat quietly near the back wall, waiting to be recalled if necessary. Unlike the attorneys surrounding him, he seemed untouched by the pressure in the room. He listened carefully. He took no notes. He sought no attention. Yet several times during testimony, Claire noticed him gently frown at certain statements. Not with judgment, with concern. Eventually, one attorney stood and confidently cited a legal interpretation that appeared to strengthen the company's position. Several spectators lowered their heads in disappointment. The argument sounded convincing. It sounded final. Claire prepared to move forward when a small movement caught her attention. Ethan had raised his hand slightly. Not dramatically, not urgently, simply enough to indicate he wished to speak. The attorney immediately looked irritated. "Your Honor," he said, "surely we are not inviting commentary from the maintenance staff." A few people chuckled nervously, but the laughter felt different now. Less certain, less comfortable. Claire glanced toward Ethan, then toward the attorney. For the first time since the hearing began, her response came without hesitation. "Mr. Walker," she said calmly, "what would you like to add?" And just like that, every head in the courtroom turned toward the quiet custodian once again. The courtroom settled into an uneasy silence as Ethan rose from his chair. The sound of his shoes crossing the polished floor seemed louder than usual. Reporters lowered their pens. Residents facing the possible loss of their homes watched carefully. Even the attorneys appeared uncertain. Something about the atmosphere had shifted. The confidence that had filled the room earlier now felt fragile. Ethan stopped beside the witness stand and folded his hands calmly. Judge Claire Whitmore met his eyes. For the first time since the proceedings began, there was no trace of condescension in her expression. Only curiosity. "Go ahead, Mr. Walker," she said. Ethan nodded respectfully. "Thank you, Your Honor." The attorney representing the development company crossed his arms. "This should be interesting." A few muted chuckles followed, but they faded quickly. Ethan did not react. He turned toward the large display screen showing maps, ownership records, and legal summaries. The interpretation presented a moment ago relies on Section E of the redevelopment statute, he said quietly. Specifically the phrase concerning economic revitalization zones. The attorney smiled confidently. "That is correct." Ethan nodded. "But the phrase cannot be separated from the paragraph that follows it." "It absolutely can," the attorney replied. "The statute is clear." Ethan remained calm. The statute is clear when read completely. The attorney opened a binder and flipped through several pages. "The language supports our position." Ethan glanced briefly toward the document. "Only if you stop reading halfway through the section." A few heads turned. Several reporters began typing again. The attorney frowned. "And what exactly are you suggesting?" Ethan walked slowly toward the screen. "I am suggesting that the purpose of the statute was never economic expansion alone." He pointed toward a highlighted sentence. "The purpose was to balance economic expansion with community preservation." The attorney immediately shook his head. "That language is secondary." "No," Ethan replied. "It is foundational." The exchange lasted only seconds, yet the room felt different. It no longer sounded like a maintenance worker offering an opinion. It sounded like someone explaining a concept he understood deeply. Claire watched closely. The attorney adjusted his tie. "Your Honor, with respect, this is becoming speculation." Ethan looked toward the bench. "May I ask a question?" Claire nodded. "You may." Ethan turned back to the attorney. "How many times has your team referenced subsection 4 today?" "Several." "And subsection 5? The attorney hesitated. "That section is not relevant." Ethan tilted his head slightly. "Then why does subsection 5 begin with the words "in order to protect existing residents"? Silence. The attorney opened his binder again. Pages turned rapidly. Spectators exchanged glances. Somewhere near the back row, a woman whose family faced eviction leaned forward in her seat. Ethan waited patiently. He showed no sign of satisfaction. No desire to embarrass anyone. Only patience. Finally, the attorney found the page. His eyes moved across the text. The confidence in his posture weakened almost immediately. Ethan spoke again. "The law was designed to prevent redevelopment from becoming displacement." The room remained still. Claire felt a chill run through her thoughts. She had read those words herself the previous evening. They were part of the legislative commentary she had discovered. Commentary written by Ethan Walker. "Mr. Walker," Claire said carefully, "how familiar are you with the drafting history of this statute?" Every eye in the courtroom shifted toward him. The question seemed simple, yet everyone sensed its weight. Ethan was silent for a moment. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. Rain tapped against distant courthouse windows. Finally he answered, more familiar than most. The response was modest, almost understated, yet it carried an unexpected gravity. Daniel Mercer looked down at the records sitting beside him. Harold Benson, seated near the rear of the courtroom, quietly closed his eyes. He knew exactly how much Ethan was leaving unsaid. The attorney attempted to recover. "Even if that interpretation were accepted, it changes nothing." Ethan nodded. "Then you would not object to reviewing the original legislative notes?" The attorney blinked. "The original notes?" "Yes." Ethan's voice remained calm. "The archived notes explaining the intent behind every paragraph." A murmur spread through the gallery. Claire sat forward slightly. "Do those notes still exist?" Ethan looked toward her. "They should be in the county archive." The attorney's confidence faded another step. Claire immediately turned toward the clerk's desk. "Mr. Mercer, locate those records." "Right away, Your Honor." As Daniel hurried from the courtroom, an unusual stillness settled over everyone present. No one was laughing anymore. No one seemed eager to dismiss the quiet custodian standing near the witness stand. And somewhere deep inside the minds of everyone watching, the same question was beginning to grow. Who exactly was Ethan Walker? The wait felt longer than it actually was. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. The courtroom remained suspended in a strange state between certainty and doubt. No one spoke much. The development company's attorneys reviewed documents with increasing urgency. Residents whispered quietly among themselves. Reporters refreshed notes and checked recording devices. Yet the center of attention remained the same man standing calmly near the witness stand. Ethan Walker showed no sign of anxiety. He simply returned to his seat and waited. The composure itself seemed to unsettle people. Most witnesses grew nervous under scrutiny. Most people became defensive when challenged. Ethan did neither. Judge Claire Whitmore observed him from the bench. The more she watched, the more difficult it became to reconcile the man before her with the assumptions she had made only a day earlier. She remembered the laughter. She remembered her own dismissive remarks. Those memories now felt increasingly uncomfortable. Finally, the courtroom doors opened. Daniel Mercer entered carrying a thick archival box coated in a thin layer of dust. Every conversation stopped immediately. The box looked ordinary, yet its arrival changed the atmosphere completely. Daniel approached the bench and carefully placed the records before Claire. "We found them, Your Honor." Claire looked down. "The original legislative notes?" "Yes." Daniel nodded. "Stored in the county archive exactly where Mr. Walker said they would be." A murmur moved through the gallery. The lead attorney for the development company shifted uneasily. Claire opened the box. Inside rested hundreds of pages organized by year, committee review, and drafting revisions. Some pages were marked with handwritten notes. Others contained legal commentary and explanatory language. The paper had yellowed with age. Yet the records were remarkably complete. Claire selected the first binder and began reading. Within moments, her expression changed. The commentary aligned precisely with Ethan's explanation. Section after section emphasized the same principle. Economic development was never intended to override community protection. The balance was deliberate. The wording was intentional. The legislative intent was unmistakable. Claire turned another page. Then another. The courtroom watched silently. She stopped when she reached a page containing handwritten revision notes attached to the final draft. A signature appeared at the bottom. Ethan Walker. Several people leaned forward in their seats. Claire stared at the page. Daniel stared at the page. Even the opposing attorneys seemed unable to look away. Finally, Claire lifted her eyes toward Ethan. "Mr. Walker." His expression remained calm. "Yes, Your Honor." She held up the document. "Is this your signature?" The room became completely silent. Ethan glanced toward the page. "Yes." No dramatic speech followed. No attempt to impress anyone. Just a simple answer. Yet the effect was immediate. Several reporters nearly dropped their pens. One attorney blinked repeatedly, as though trying to process what he had heard. A woman seated in the gallery covered her mouth in surprise. Claire lowered the document slowly. "You helped draft these revisions." "I did." "And the explanatory notes?" "Yes." "And the language concerning resident protections?" Ethan nodded once. "That section mattered to me." The simplicity of the response somehow carried even greater weight. Claire studied him carefully. "Why did you never mention any of this?" Ethan looked around the courtroom. Rows of worried families filled the benches. Elderly residents. Young parents. People who simply wanted to keep their homes. Then he looked back toward the bench. "Because this case is not about me." Silence returned. Deep silence. The kind that arrives when people suddenly recognize character where they expected pride. The attorney representing the development company attempted to recover. "Your Honor, regardless of authorship, the statute must still be interpreted according to current law." Claire nodded. "That is true." Then she glanced down at the records again. "Which is precisely why the original intent is relevant." The attorney said nothing. For the first time since proceedings began, his confidence appeared genuinely shaken. Meanwhile, Ethan simply sat back down. He folded his hands and resumed listening. Nothing about his posture suggested victory. Nothing suggested satisfaction. He seemed entirely uninterested in recognition. And that realization struck Claire harder than any legal revelation. Most people spent their lives seeking acknowledgement. Ethan had spent 2 decades avoiding it. Outside, rain continued tapping softly against the courthouse windows. Inside, an entirely different storm had begun. Because the question was no longer whether Ethan Walker understood the law. The evidence had answered that beyond doubt. The question now was why a man capable of shaping laws studied across the country had chosen a life so quiet that an entire courthouse had forgotten who he was. When the hearing finally recessed for lunch, very few people left their seats right away. The revelation had settled over the courtroom like a heavy fog. Conversations remained hushed. Reporters who had arrived expecting a routine property dispute were suddenly making phone calls. Attorneys gathered in small groups, speaking in careful tones. Yet the person attracting the most attention seemed completely unaware of it. Ethan Walker quietly collected a stack of unused documents left behind near the witness stand and carried them toward a recycling bin. The simple act somehow made the contrast even more striking. A man whose legal work had influenced statewide policy was still picking up after everyone else. Judge Claire Whitmore watched from her chamber's doorway across the hall. She had spent years studying people. Judges learned to read confidence, deception, fear, and ambition. Yet Ethan remained unusually difficult to understand. The more she learned about him, the less he seemed interested in the things most people valued. Recognition meant nothing. Status meant nothing. Even now, after the courtroom had effectively discovered part of his past, he behaved exactly as he had the day before. Claire stepped into the hallway. "Mr. Walker." Ethan turned. "Your Honor, do you have a few minutes?" He glanced at the clock mounted near the elevator. "A few." Claire nodded toward an empty conference room. Moments later, they sat across from one another at a long oak table. Rain continued falling outside, creating soft patterns against the windows. Neither spoke immediately. For the first time since meeting him, Claire felt strangely uncertain. "I owe you an apology," she said at last. Ethan looked surprised. "For what?" The question caught her off guard. "For yesterday." He remained silent. "I made assumptions about you." Ethan offered a small smile. "Most people do. That does not make it right." He studied her for a moment before speaking. "No, it does not." The honesty of the answer carried no bitterness, no accusation, only truth. Claire folded her hands together. "Why did you never correct anyone?" Ethan looked toward the rain beyond the glass. "Correct them about what?" "About who you are." He smiled faintly. "Who I was, you mean? Is there a difference?" The question lingered between them. Ethan took a slow breath. "A very big difference." Claire waited. 20 years ago, I cared about arguments, publications, recognition." His voice remained calm. "Then my priorities changed." "Because of your wife?" Ethan nodded. The room grew quiet. "Emily was extraordinary," he said softly. "She could walk into a room and make everyone feel important." Claire noticed something shift in his eyes when he spoke her name. Not pain exactly. Something gentler. Something deeper. When she became sick, every decision suddenly became simple. He looked down briefly. Career or family stopped being a difficult choice. Claire listened carefully. Ethan continued. "By the time she passed away, Lily needed someone more than the world needed another legal scholar." Silence followed. The fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. Rainwater traced winding paths down the window glass. Claire found herself staring at the man she had once dismissed as insignificant. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. Ethan answered without hesitation. "Not for a second." The certainty in his voice surprised her. Most people carried regrets. Most people wondered what might have been. Ethan did not seem burdened by either. His phone suddenly vibrated on the table. A photograph appeared on the screen. Claire accidentally caught a glimpse before looking away. It showed a young girl sitting beside a hospital bed, smiling while holding another drawing. Ethan's entire expression changed. His eyes brightened immediately. The transformation was impossible to miss. Claire smiled. "Lily." "Yes." He looked at the photograph for a moment before putting the phone away. "She likes to send updates." Claire hesitated. "Is she doing well?" Ethan considered the question carefully. Some days are easier than others. Before Claire could respond, a knock sounded at the conference room door. Daniel Mercer stepped inside carrying a folder. "Your Honor, I thought you should see this immediately." Claire accepted the folder and opened it. Her eyes widened. The document contained records recently pulled from a university archive. Several legal experts were requesting confirmation that the Ethan Walker involved in the housing case was the same Ethan Walker whose research had become required reading in law schools across the country. News of the discovery was spreading fast. Claire slowly lowered the folder. Across the table, Ethan simply sighed. Not with pride. Not with excitement. with the weary resignation of a man who knew his quiet life was about to become much more complicated. By the time the afternoon session resumed, word had spread far beyond the courthouse walls. Reporters who had never shown interest in local property disputes were now calling editors. Former professors were sending emails. Legal organizations were quietly confirming records that many people had forgotten existed. Yet inside courtroom 3, Ethan Walker remained exactly where he had always been, seated quietly near the back, listening more than speaking. The attention surrounding him seemed almost disconnected from the man himself. As residents returned to their seats, several glanced toward him with a mixture of curiosity and respect. A day earlier, most had seen a custodian. Now they saw someone whose influence had been hiding in plain sight for years. Judge Claire Whitmore noticed the change immediately. People spoke differently when Ethan entered the room. They lowered their voices. They chose their words more carefully. Yet Ethan responded to every greeting the same way he always had, with a small smile and a polite nod. No speeches, no stories, no attempt to explain himself. The hearing resumed with renewed intensity. Attorneys adjusted arguments. Documents were reviewed again. Portions of testimony that once seemed settled suddenly required closer examination. The original legislative notes had changed everything. Several assumptions no longer held up under scrutiny. Claire listened carefully as both sides presented revised interpretations. Then something unexpected happened. An elderly woman named Margaret Holloway was called to testify. She had lived in one of the affected neighborhoods for more than 40 years. Her voice trembled slightly as she described raising her children in the same small home, planting trees in the front yard, and watching grandchildren play beneath them years later. The courtroom grew quiet as she spoke. To some people, she said softly, these are properties. To us, they are memories. No one interrupted. Even the attorneys remained silent. Margaret eventually stepped down and returned to her seat. As she passed Ethan, she paused briefly. Thank you, she whispered. Ethan looked surprised. For what? Margaret smiled. For remembering people like us when you wrote those laws. Before Ethan could answer, she continued walking. The words seemed to linger in the air long after she left. Claire watched the exchange carefully. Something about it struck her deeply. Throughout law school and throughout her career, she had learned to think in terms of statutes, precedents, and legal reasoning. Necessary things. Important things. Yet listening to Margaret, she suddenly understood something Ethan appeared to have understood years ago. Laws were never only about language. They were about people. During another brief recess, Claire found herself reviewing Ethan's old commentary again. This time she noticed details she had overlooked before. The notes were unusually compassionate. They discussed families, neighborhoods, stability, and dignity. The legal reasoning was brilliant, but beneath it existed something even more powerful. Empathy. Every paragraph seemed written by someone who genuinely cared about ordinary people. Daniel Mercer entered carrying a fresh stack of correspondence. More messages? Claire asked. Daniel nodded. Universities. Legal journals. Former colleagues. He hesitated. One of them called Ethan Walker one of the great lost minds of American legal scholarship. Claire looked toward the courtroom door. Lost? Daniel shrugged. That was the phrase they used. Claire remained silent. Somehow the description felt wrong. Lost implied something tragic, something wasted. Yet the more she learned about Ethan, the less she believed that. A man who spent every day caring for his daughter, helping strangers, and protecting families through laws he had written did not seem lost at all. He seemed unusually clear about what mattered. Back inside the courtroom, proceedings continued into the evening. The rain outside finally stopped. Sunlight broke through clouds and streamed across the windows, filling the room with warm golden light. The shift transformed the atmosphere. Shadows softened. Faces appeared calmer. Ethan glanced at his phone and saw a new message from Lily. It contained another drawing. This one showed a large courthouse surrounded by dozens of tiny houses. Above them, she had written a sentence in bright blue letters. Good people help people stay home. Ethan stared at the drawing for a moment and smiled. Then he quietly locked the screen and slipped the phone away. He never noticed Claire watching from across the room, but she saw the smile. And for the first time since this extraordinary story had begun, unfolding, she started to understand that Ethan Walker's greatest achievement might not be the laws he had written. It might be the life he had chosen afterward. The following morning began with clear skies and crisp autumn air. Sunlight poured across Lexington County after days of rain, casting long golden reflections across storefront windows and courthouse steps. Yet inside the courthouse, the atmosphere remained charged. The story had spread overnight. Local newspapers carried headlines about the unexpected discovery. Legal blogs discussed archived research. Former professors gave interviews. Everyone seemed fascinated by the same question. How had a man once described as one of the brightest legal minds of his generation disappeared into a life so ordinary? Ethan Walker arrived before dawn as usual. He unlocked supply closets, checked maintenance schedules, and polished brass handrails that most people never noticed. Nothing about his routine changed. If anything, he worked even harder to avoid attention. Several employees attempted to congratulate him. Ethan thanked them politely and kept moving. Recognition made him uncomfortable. It always had. Around 8 o'clock his phone rang. The caller was Lily. Her voice sounded brighter than usual. "Dad, someone brought flowers to my room." Ethan smiled. "That is nice." There were 3 arrangements. 3. And 2 cards from people I have never met. Ethan stopped beside a courthouse window. "What did they say?" Lily laughed softly. "One said thank you for helping families." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. "I see. Did you do something important?" she asked. The question made him smile. "Not today. You always say that." "Because it is usually true." Lily giggled. The sound alone improved his morning. They talked a few more minutes before she returned to a therapy session. After hanging up, Ethan stood quietly staring across the courthouse square. The attention surrounding him was already reaching people he loved. That worried him more than anything happening in court. Meanwhile, Judge Claire Whitmore entered her chambers carrying a fresh stack of documents. Waiting on her desk sat several letters from universities requesting confirmation regarding Ethan's contributions to housing reform legislation. One envelope contained copies of academic citations. Another included a speech delivered years earlier by a Supreme Court justice referencing Ethan's legal framework. Claire read the material carefully. The evidence continued building. Yet one detail fascinated her more than all the accomplishments combined. Every account described Ethan as brilliant. None described him as ambitious. Even in his younger years, colleagues consistently mentioned humility. One professor had written a simple observation in a recommendation letter. Ethan Walker never cared about being the smartest person in the room. He cared about solving problems for people who had no voice. Claire read that sentence twice, then a third time. By mid-morning, the courtroom was once again filled beyond capacity. Residents packed the gallery. Reporters occupied every available seat. The development company's attorneys appeared increasingly cautious. Their confidence had been replaced by careful preparation. They understood now that the legal foundation beneath their argument was weaker than they originally believed. As proceedings resumed, additional archival evidence was introduced. Original committee records confirmed the purpose Ethan had described. Notes, revisions, and commentary all pointed toward the same conclusion. The law had been written to protect communities, not displace them. The evidence was becoming overwhelming. During testimony, one attorney attempted a final argument. "Intent is valuable," he said, "but courts must still consider modern circumstances." Claire nodded. "Agreed." The attorney continued. "Economic growth benefits everyone." Before anyone responded, an elderly resident quietly raised her hand from the gallery. Claire normally would not allow interruptions. Yet something about the moment felt different. "Yes, ma'am." The woman stood slowly. "I just wanted to say something." Claire allowed it. The woman looked toward Ethan. "My husband worked 38 years at the steel mill. We bought our house with savings collected one paycheck at a time." Her voice trembled. "People keep talking about economic growth. We are talking about home." The courtroom fell silent. No legal argument could compete with that kind of truth. Ethan lowered his eyes respectfully. He never sought these moments. Yet they seemed to find him anyway. Claire observed the exchange carefully. More and more she realized that Ethan's greatest strength was not intelligence. It was perspective. He never forgot the human beings hidden behind legal language. And as the hearing moved closer to its conclusion, that perspective was beginning to change the entire case. As the hearing entered its final phase, a quiet sense of inevitability settled over the courtroom. The frantic energy that had dominated the early days was gone. In its place stood something steadier. Facts, records, history. The evidence continued pointing in the same direction no matter how carefully it was examined. The original legislative notes, the committee reports, the archived correspondence, and the testimony all supported a single conclusion. The protections written into the law had been intentional from the very beginning. Families were never meant to become collateral damage in the name of redevelopment. Sunlight streamed through the tall courthouse windows, casting warm bands of gold across rows of wooden benches. The reporters who had once focused almost entirely on Ethan Walker were now turning their attention toward the broader implications of the case. What had started as a local dispute was becoming a statewide conversation about fairness, responsibility, and the purpose of the law itself. Claire Whitmore listened carefully as the final witnesses concluded their testimony. Every so often her eyes drifted toward Ethan. He remained exactly as he had been from the beginning. Quiet, attentive, respectful. He never interrupted, never sought recognition, never attempted to influence the attention suddenly surrounding him. If anything, he seemed eager for the spotlight to move elsewhere. During a short recess, Claire stepped into the hallway and found Harold Benson reviewing files near the clerk's office. "Harold," she said softly. The elderly clerk looked up. "Judge." Claire hesitated. "Did everyone know?" Harold smiled faintly. "Know what?" "Who Ethan was." Harold leaned against the filing cabinet. "A few of us knew pieces of it. And nobody said anything?" "He never wanted anyone to." Claire looked down the hallway toward the maintenance corridor. "Why?" Harold's eyes softened. "Because he never measured his worth that way." Claire remained silent. Harold continued. "You know what Ethan used to tell people?" "What?" "That being important and being useful are not always the same thing." The words lingered with her long after she walked away. Back inside the courtroom, the final legal arguments began. The development company's lead attorney stood and delivered a polished presentation. He spoke about investment, infrastructure, and future opportunities. His reasoning was professional and carefully prepared. When he finished, the courtroom listened respectfully. Then counsel representing the residents rose to speak. She did not begin with legal citations. She began with names. Names of families. Names of neighborhoods. Names of people who had spent decades building lives within those communities. She spoke about stability, belonging, dignity. And as she spoke, many eyes drifted toward Ethan once again because everyone now understood that those same principles had guided the creation of the law itself. The hearing eventually concluded. Claire announced that she would review the final materials before issuing her decision. As people began gathering their belongings, a strange calm filled the room. No one seemed eager to leave. Residents approached one another with cautious hope. Reporters packed equipment more slowly than usual. Even the attorneys appeared reflective. Ethan quietly stood and began collecting several empty water bottles left behind near the gallery. The sight stopped Claire in her tracks. After everything that had happened, after every revelation, after every headline, he was still cleaning the room. She walked down from the bench and approached him. "Mr. Walker." Ethan looked up. "Your Honor." Claire glanced at the bottles in his hand and smiled slightly. "You really are incapable of leaving a mess behind, aren't you?" Ethan laughed. Softly. It was the first genuine laugh she had heard from him. Occupational habit. For a moment neither spoke. Then Claire said something she had been thinking about for days. "You changed this case." Ethan shook his head immediately. "No, you did. The facts changed the case." Claire studied him carefully. "You honestly believe that?" "Yes." He placed the bottles into a recycling container. "The truth does not need help. It only needs a chance to be heard." Claire felt a quiet sense of humility settle over her. There was wisdom in that sentence. Wisdom earned through sacrifice rather than achievement. As Ethan turned to leave, his phone vibrated. He checked the screen and immediately smiled. Claire recognized the expression. Another message from Lily. Another reminder of what truly mattered to him. And as he walked toward the courthouse exit, carrying nothing but his phone, his keys, and the quiet dignity that had guided every step of his life, Claire realized she was witnessing something rarer than genius. She was witnessing character. 3 days later, the courthouse was packed once again. Every seat in courtroom 3 was occupied. Additional chairs had been placed along the walls. Reporters filled the back rows. Residents stood shoulder to shoulder near the entrance. The decision day had arrived. Outside, television vans lined the street. Inside, A quiet anticipation settled over everyone present. Judge Claire Whitmore entered precisely at 9 o'clock. The room rose. Then silence followed. Deep silence. The kind that appears when people understand they are about to witness something important. Claire took her seat and reviewed several pages before looking up. Her expression was calm but thoughtful. During the previous days, she had examined every argument, every statute, every archived note, and every piece of testimony. The evidence had left little room for doubt. Yet as she looked across the courtroom, she realized the legal decision was only part of what had happened there. Something else had unfolded. Something no one had anticipated. Her eyes briefly found Ethan Walker seated quietly near the side wall. He wore the same maintenance uniform, the same worn work shoes, the same calm expression. Nothing about him suggested he had become the center of statewide attention. If anything, he seemed slightly uncomfortable with it. Claire began reading. Her voice carried clearly through the room. She outlined the legal findings carefully. She explained the legislative intent. She referenced the original records. She cited the archived commentary and supporting documentation. Every sentence moved steadily toward the same conclusion. By the time she reached the final pages, many residents already understood what was coming. Several clasped their hands together. Others wiped tears from their eyes. Then Claire delivered the decision. The redevelopment plan could not proceed under its current structure because it violated the protections intentionally built into the law. The affected families would retain their legal protections. For a moment, nobody moved. The words seemed to hang in the air. Then relief swept through the courtroom. Quiet at first, then stronger. Several residents embraced one another. Some cried openly. Others simply sat in stunned gratitude. Yet, even amid the emotion, Claire continued speaking. "Before we adjourn," she said. The room gradually became silent again. Claire looked toward Ethan. "There is one additional matter I wish to address." Every head turned. Ethan appeared surprised. Claire took a slow breath. "Several days ago, in this very courtroom, I made assumptions about a man standing among us." The room remained perfectly still. "I assumed education could be measured by appearance. I assumed value could be measured by position. I assumed I understood someone I had never truly taken the time to know." Ethan lowered his eyes slightly. Claire continued, "The court has learned much during these proceedings. So have I." No one spoke. No one moved. Even the reporters stopped typing. "Mr. Walker," Claire said softly, "I owe you a public apology." The silence deepened. Ethan looked up. Claire met his gaze directly. "Not because you helped shape the law. Not because your work influenced courts across the country. But because I failed to show you the respect every person deserves regardless of title or occupation." The room became completely motionless. The apology was genuine, honest, unrehearsed. Ethan stood slowly. For a moment, everyone waited. Some expected a speech. Others expected vindication. Instead, Ethan simply smiled. "Apology accepted, Your Honor." Nothing more. No lecture. No triumph. No attempt to make the moment about himself. The simplicity of the response somehow carried greater power than any speech could have. Claire felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. Around the courtroom, people exchanged quiet glances. They had come expecting legal drama. What they witnessed instead was something far rarer. Grace. Ethan gathered his belongings and prepared to leave. As he reached the aisle, a young law student seated near the back stood abruptly. "Mr. Walker?" Ethan paused. "Yes." The student looked nervous. "What happened to your career?" A few people shifted uncomfortably. It seemed like an intrusive question, yet Ethan considered it carefully. Then he smiled. "My career ended exactly where it was supposed to." The student frowned. Ethan pulled out his phone and opened the latest photograph Lily had sent him. He looked at it for a moment before putting the phone away. "I got something better." No one asked another question. They did not need to, because for the first time, the entire room understood. The courthouse slowly emptied after the ruling, but the impact of the day refused to leave with the crowd. Conversations lingered in hallways. Reporters gathered outside beneath the afternoon sun. Residents stood on the courthouse steps sharing hugs, handshakes, and quiet tears of relief. For many families, uncertainty had been replaced with hope. Yet while cameras searched for statements and microphones searched for headlines, Ethan Walker slipped quietly through a side corridor carrying a small toolbox and a ring of maintenance keys. The same man who had become the center of statewide attention was already returning to work. He replaced a burned-out light bulb on the second floor. He checked a leaking faucet near the public records office. He carried a stack of folded chairs back into storage. Life moved forward. That evening, Claire Whitmore remained alone in her chambers long after everyone else had gone home. The courthouse felt different now, quieter. The sunlight had faded into soft shades of orange and blue beyond the windows. Shadows stretched across bookshelves lined with legal volumes. For the first time in years, Claire found herself looking beyond statutes and case law. Her desk held dozens of documents connected to Ethan's legal work. Academic articles, archive commentary, letters from respected scholars. Enough accomplishments to fill an entire career. Yet none of them seemed as important as a single sentence he had spoken. The truth does not need help. It only needs a chance to be heard. Claire leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. She remembered the first day, the laughter, the assumptions, the certainty she had carried without questioning it. The memory was uncomfortable, but it was also necessary, because growth rarely arrived through comfort. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Daniel Mercer stepped into the room. "Still here?" he asked. Claire smiled faintly. Apparently, Daniel placed an envelope on her desk. This arrived an hour ago. Claire opened it carefully. Inside was a formal invitation from a prestigious legal institution requesting Ethan Walker as the keynote speaker for a national conference. She shook her head slightly. They found him quickly. Daniel laughed. "Everyone is looking for him now." Claire glanced toward the darkening courthouse square. "I wonder if he will accept." "Do you think he will?" Claire thought about Lily's photographs, about the maintenance uniform, about the man who never chased recognition. "No," she answered softly. "I do not." Across town, Ethan sat beside Lily's hospital bed. Evening light filtered through the window overlooking the city. The room smelled faintly of fresh flowers and clean linens. Several bouquets sat on a nearby table. Cards from strangers filled a small basket. Lily examined each one with fascination. "People really sent all these?" she asked. "Looks that way." Ethan smiled. "They think you are important." Ethan laughed quietly. "No, they think the case was important." Lily studied him carefully. "I think they are both important." Ethan looked away for a moment. Sometimes children saw things adults missed. Lily reached into her sketchbook and pulled out a folded page. "I made another drawing." Ethan opened it. The picture showed a large courtroom. Rows of people sat watching. At the center stood a man wearing a maintenance uniform. Above the crowd, she had drawn a bright yellow sun. Beneath the image, she had written a simple sentence. "Being kind matters even when nobody is watching." Ethan stared at the drawing. For a moment, he could not speak. Then he carefully folded the page and slipped it into his shirt pocket. "I like this one," he said. Lily smiled proudly. Outside the hospital room, the evening sky deepened into shades of violet and gold. Inside the courthouse, Claire remained seated alone with her thoughts. Inside the hospital, Ethan sat quietly beside his daughter. Miles apart, both reflected on the same lesson. Titles fade. Recognition fades. Even extraordinary accomplishments eventually become old stories stored in dusty archives. But character remains. Grace remains. And sometimes the greatest victory is not proving who you are. It is remaining kind after the world fails to see it. In the days ahead, newspapers would continue writing about Ethan Walker. Universities would continue calling. Scholars would continue debating his influence. Yet the moment people remembered most would not be a legal argument or a courtroom victory. It would be the silence that followed when everyone finally realized the quiet custodian had never needed recognition to possess dignity. Several months passed, and the attention that had once surrounded Lexington County slowly faded. Reporters moved on to other stories. Television crews disappeared. Headlines were replaced by newer headlines. The world continued doing what it always does. It kept moving. Yet some things had changed permanently. The families protected by the court's decision remained in their homes. Front porches still welcomed neighbors in the evenings. Children still rode bicycles along familiar sidewalks. Gardens still bloomed in front yards planted decades earlier. The law had done what it was originally intended to do. It had protected people. On a bright spring morning, sunlight spilled across the courthouse steps as employees arrived for another ordinary workday. Birds sang from nearby trees. Fresh flowers lined the town square. Inside the building, Familiar sounds echoed through the hallways. Doors opened. Phones rang. Clerks organized files. And just as he had done for years, Ethan Walker pushed his maintenance cart through the lobby before most people had even finished their first cup of coffee. Some things never changed. He still greeted everyone by name. He still stopped to help visitors find offices. He still repaired loose fixtures and polished railings without expecting anyone to notice. Yet now people noticed anyway. Not because of his past, because of his example. New employees often heard the story during their first weeks at the courthouse. Not the version about legal scholarship. Not the version about newspaper articles. The version people preferred to tell was simpler. They spoke about a man who treated everyone with respect regardless of status. A man who never demanded recognition. A man who proved that dignity does not depend on a job title. One afternoon, Claire Whitmore stood near the courthouse entrance watching employees leave for the day. She had changed too. The experience had left a permanent mark on her perspective. She listened more carefully now, judged less quickly, asked more questions. Several months earlier, she might have believed wisdom belonged primarily to experts and credentials. Now she understood something deeper. Wisdom often hides in unexpected places. Through the glass doors, she saw Ethan crossing the parking lot carrying a backpack and a small paper bag. She stepped outside. "Leaving early?" she called. Ethan smiled. "For once." "Special occasion?" "Very special." Claire noticed the familiar warmth in his expression. "Lily." Ethan nodded proudly. "She is coming home today." Claire's face brightened immediately. "That is wonderful." "It is." For a brief moment, neither spoke. Then Claire handed him a small envelope. "This arrived for you." Ethan looked confused. "Another conference invitation?" "No," Claire smiled. "Open it." Ethan carefully unfolded the paper inside. It contained a handwritten note signed by dozens of courthouse employees. Some had worked there for decades. Others had arrived recently. The message itself was short. "Thank you for teaching us that respect should never depend on a title." Ethan read the note quietly. Then he folded it again. "This means more than they realize." Claire believed him, because she understood him now. The greatest honors were rarely the loudest ones. That evening, Ethan drove to the hospital beneath a sky painted gold and orange by the setting sun. When Lily finally walked through the front entrance carrying her sketchbook and smiling from ear to ear, every difficult year suddenly felt worthwhile. Ethan knelt and hugged her carefully. She laughed and pointed toward the truck. "Did you bring snacks?" He laughed too. "Of course." "Good. Recovery makes me hungry." Together they climbed into the truck and headed home. As they drove through familiar streets, Lily looked out the window. "Dad." "Yes." "Are you famous now?" Ethan nearly laughed. "Definitely not." "Good." She leaned back in her seat. "I liked you better before." Ethan smiled. "I liked me better before too." The answer made her laugh all over again. The truck disappeared down a quiet road lined with spring trees and evening light. No cameras followed. No reporters waited. No applause echoed in the distance. Just a father and daughter heading home. And perhaps that was always the real ending. Not the courtroom. Not the revelation. Not the public apology. The real ending was a life built on quiet choices repeated day after day. A life defined by grace instead of recognition. By service instead of status. By love instead of ambition. Because in the end, the most powerful moment was never when people discovered who Ethan Walker had once been. It was when they finally understood who he had chosen to become. And in that understanding, there was silence. Not the silence of embarrassment. Not the silence of defeat. But the silence of respect.